Let's talk about another type of government intervention into a free market, and that is taxes. So if we think about a tax, there are several different types of taxes. Some of them are what we would call a per unit tax. Some of them are a percentage tax, so you may be used to thinking about, say, a sales tax where you have to pay 2% more. So it's a percentage of the total amount of stuff that you've bought you would pay. What we're going to think about is a per unit tax. So this would be a tax of, say, $1 every time you buy something, or a tax of $5 every time you buy something. So for every unit, you pay $5 tax. And the way these taxes work, very similar to the way a percentage tax works, so we're going to go with the simplest one. So let's start by thinking about kind of a hypothetical scenario. Let's suppose that you've gone down to a car lot and you've picked out a used car that you're going to buy, or maybe a new car that you're going to buy, and let's suppose the total price of that car is $10,000. And you haven't paid for it, but you've told the people there that own the car lot that you want it, and they're going to hold it for you till tomorrow morning, and you're going to show up and write a check or however, you're going to pay $10,000 for that car. And then you go home tonight and you're watching the news and you see a news story that says that effective immediately, the Missouri legislature has just passed a tax on car sellers, and every time they sell a car, they're going to have to send $1,000 to the government. So now think about what's going to happen when you go down tomorrow to buy that car. Think about whether or not they're going to still sell you that car for $1,000. Because remember, you haven't signed any contract or anything. You just picked the car out. The price was going to be $10,000, and then now all of a sudden something's changed. If I ask that to a face-to-face class, if I ask them, so what's the price going to be? Everyone agrees that it's going to be higher than it was the day before because now there's a tax. And most people will say, if I ask them what's the price going to be, most people will say it's going to be $11,000 because now the car yesterday cost $1,000. Today it cost $10,000. Today there's a new $1,000 tax on the car that the seller is going to have to send off to the government. So they're going to charge you $11,000. And that feels like the way a tax works. It feels like all you have to do is take the tax and add it to the original price. Turns out that's not at all how a tax works. And so what we have to do is we've got to go through and think about how a tax affects the incentives of the buyers and the sellers. And what we're going to see is that that tax will cause the demand curve or the supply curve, depending on who's taxed, it will cause that to shift. And that's going to change the prices, it's going to change the quantities. So a tax is not as simple as everybody thinks. Everybody thinks out there in the real world. Everybody thinks they understand how taxes work. And almost nobody really does. So let's think about a tax. Let's start with a tax levied on the buyers. So a tax levied on buyers. Let's suppose the tax is equal to $T. Okay, so that could be $1 per unit or $5 or $50 or $1,000 per unit. But this is a tax levied on the buyers. So when the buyers buy the good, they have to additionally send off some money to the government. Okay? So we need to first think about which curve shifts. We need to then think about how much it shifts or which direction it shifts, not how much, which direction. And then we need to draw the picture and think about what happens. So clearly this is a tax levied on buyers, and that's going to influence the demand curve because that's the curve that represents the buyers. So let's think about a different example. Let's suppose that you're hungry, it's lunchtime, you're hungry, and you're willing to pay $10 for a pizza. If you call up the pizza place and they tell you that the price of a pizza is $7, you buy it. Or if they tell you it's $8, you buy it. Or if they tell you it's $9.75, you buy it. You're willing to pay $10. But if they tell you it's $10.25, you say, no, I'm not going to buy it. I'll buy something else. Okay? So now let's suppose that all of a sudden, when you pay that price for the pizza, you have to turn around also and send $1 to the government. Let's suppose there's a $1 tax on pizzas. Now think about the most you'd be willing to pay the pizza place for the pizza. If you call them up and they tell you it's $5, you would say, okay, I'll take the pizza because you pay them $5, you send $1 to the government, that's $6 total. That's fine. You were willing to pay $10. If they tell you $7, you say, okay, I'll do it. So you pay them $7 for the pizza, you send your $1 to the government, that adds up to $8. That's great. But think about the most that the pizza place will tell you, that the highest price before you decide not to buy it. It's going to be $9, right? So now, if they tell you $9.25, you're going to say, you know what, never mind. Because if you pay them $9.25 and then another $1 to the government, that's more than you were willing to pay for the pizza. So what happens is that a tax on buyers reduces willingness to pay by the amount of the tax. And that's important. This is extremely important. Reduces willingness to pay by the amount of the tax. Okay? Now, let's talk about how that shows up graphically. If we think about a demand curve, remember the height of that demand curve represents willingness to pay. So if we look at a particular quantity and we go up to the demand curve, the height there represents the willingness to pay at the margin. So if, let's suppose at this quantity you're willing to pay this amount, let's call that Q1 P1, and then all of a sudden a tax of $T is imposed, we know that that tax is going to reduce your willingness to pay by the amount of the tax. If it's a $1 tax, it reduces your willingness to pay by $1. So your willingness to pay is going to fall by the amount of the tax, T. And so if we draw the demand curve that represents your new willingness to pay, this I will call the demand curve with the tax, it's going to be $T directly below the old demand curve. It reduces your willingness to pay because now if you buy this unit of the good, you're only going to be willing to pay this amount to the seller, and then you've got to turn around and send $T to the government, and that adds up to your total amount that you're willing to pay. Okay? So that's the effect of a tax on buyers. So now we've figured out which curve shifts, we've figured out which direction it shifts, straight down by $T. Now we just have to draw the picture. So let's analyze the effect of a tax here. Let's start with a demand curve and the supply curve. Let's identify our initial equilibrium here at point A. Here's our initial price of P1 and our initial quantity of Q1. So let's put our story over here. We're going to start at A. Price equals P1, quantity equals Q1. And let's suppose that we impose a tax on buyers. Tax on buyers of $T per unit. That's going to shift the demand curve straight down by $T. Here's the demand curve with the tax. Now let's think about where our new equilibrium is. Our new equilibrium is right down here at point B. All right, there's point B. Let's start by thinking about the effect on quantity. So not surprisingly, the quantity is going to fall. And most people find that to be pretty intuitive. Anytime the government imposes a tax, less of the goods are going to be bought and sold. So quantity falls, let's say, to Q2. Now let's think about how this is going to affect the prices. So let's start by thinking about how it's going to affect the price that the buyer pays to the seller. Notice that it's actually going to drive down the price that the buyer pays to the seller. Right here is the price that the buyer pays to the seller. We're going to call it PS. I'm going to call that the seller's price. Because what's happened is that the tax reduces consumers' willingness to pay. And so consequently, they're going to be willing to pay the sellers less than before. So from the seller's perspective, that's the end of the story. Once they sell the good to the buyer, the seller's not being taxed, so they get to put those dollars in their pocket, that's it. But if we look at what happens for the buyer, this is not the end of the story for the buyer. The buyer has to pay this to the seller and then pay T dollars to the government. And if we add T from this price, if we add another T, remember the vertical distance between these two curves is T, so that takes us right back up to the original curve. There's the buyer's price. I'm going to call it PB. That's the final price that the buyer has to pay. The distance between the price that the buyer pays and the price that the seller gets to keep is the tax T. So here's the surprising thing. If we look at the implications of this tax, there are three surprising things that we're going to see, or we could say two surprising things. One that has to do with quantity, one that has to do with price. What we see is that quantity falls. I guess that's not really that surprising. But here's the surprising part. This tax that's imposed on buyers ends up affecting both the buyers and the sellers. It drives the buyer's price up and it drives the seller's price down. And we can think about how much it drives the seller's price up versus how much it drives the seller's price down versus how much it drives the buyer's price up. If we look at where price started, it's right here. That distance right there is how much it drove the price up for buyers. That's what we would call the buyer's burden or the buyer's incidence of the tax. Now notice, it does drive the buyer's price up, but it drives it up by less than the amount of the tax, right? If this distance between this price and that one is the amount T, then this distance clearly has to be less than T. Notice that it drives the seller's price down. That's what we would call the seller's burden of the tax or the seller's incidence of the tax. So even though the sellers were not taxed, this is a tax on buyers, the tax still ends up affecting the sellers because the tax reduces the buyer's willingness to pay. Okay, so the tax burden is going to fall on both the buyers and the sellers. Now in my picture here, it makes it look like the tax burden's a little bit bigger for the buyers and smaller for the sellers. Your picture, if you've been drawing this along with me, yours may be a little different. Yours may make it look like it's split right down the middle. What we're going to see is that it does not get split right down the middle. It depends on the elasticity of demand and the elasticity of supply. We'll do that here in a little bit. But for now, the key is that the tax is going to fall on both the buyers and the sellers. Okay? What I need to do now is clear off. I'm going to clear off some of this, and then we'll do a tax on sellers, and we'll see how that looks. All right, let's think about now what a tax levied on sellers looks like. So this was our picture of a tax levied on buyers. I'm going to put my tax levied on sellers right next to it. And I'm going to put my story right over here. So what we want to do at the end is we want to be able to compare these pictures and see what the similarities are between a tax on buyers and a tax on sellers. So let's kind of draw a similar set of demand and supply curves. My initial equilibrium's right here at point A, my initial price of P1 and initial quantity of Q1. Okay, so we're going to start at A, price equals P1, quantity equals Q1, and now let's have a tax levied on sellers. Okay, tax levied on sellers. Now, before we draw it on that picture, let's talk about the effect that a tax is going to have on sellers. So let's suppose that now you run a pizza business. And let's suppose that it costs you $5 to make a pizza. Okay, so that includes the cost of raw materials, and that includes the cost of any labor that you've got to buy from other people, and that includes the opportunity cost of your time. Let's suppose you're running the business, and so you're accepting the risk of the business, and you've put up the capital, and so you're entitled to some of the money that gets paid to the business for the pizzas. That $5 covers everything, okay? So the cost to you of selling a pizza is $5. You're going to be willing to sell the pizza for anything $5 or more. You'd never sell the pizza for $3, right? Because that's less than your cost of production. But you'd start selling it at $5. $5 covers everything. You'd love to sell it for more. You'd love to sell it for $8 or $9 or $10, or you'd really love it if you could sell pizzas for $50 or $60 or $100 each. You'd make a lot of producer surplus. But you'd be willing to sell it for anything greater than $5. Now, let's suppose that the government imposes a tax on you, and that tax is $1 per pizza. Every time you sell a pizza, you've got to send $1 to the government. Well, notice that what that does is that just adds a cost of production to you, doesn't it? It's just like the cost of your labor going up. So what that means is, if you were previously willing to sell pizzas for $5, and now all of a sudden the government imposes a $1 tax on you, then the lowest price you'd be willing to take for a pizza is going to be $6 now. So what a tax on sellers does is it increases their cost of production by the amount of the tax. Okay, so let's write that over here. A tax on sellers increases cost of production by the amount of the tax, by T dollars, whatever that tax is, and that's important. Okay? If we were to draw a little picture of what that looks like, remember that the supply curve represents the cost of production. We talked in a previous chapter about the fact that any supply curve is nothing more than a cost of production curve, and the height of that supply curve at any different point, any particular point, represents the cost of production. Well, if the cost of production is going to increase by T dollars, then that means every place along this supply curve, it's going to shift up by T dollars. So the supply curve with the tax, I'm going to write that small and you may not be able to read that. The supply curve with the tax is going to be T dollars higher than the original supply curve. Okay, so now let's go back to this picture. So this is our supply curve with no tax. Now all of a sudden the supply curve is going to shift up by the amount of the tax. Let's suppose that there's T, here's the supply curve with the tax. So now we're going to get a new intersection right up here at point B. Let's start by thinking about the effect this will have on quantity. So not surprisingly, a tax is going to decrease the amount of the goods sold. Any tax on a good discourages economic activity. So the quantity falls. Now look at what happens to the price that the buyer pays to the seller. So right there is the buyer's price. That's the price the buyer pays to the seller. And from the buyer's perspective, that's the end of the story. This is a tax on sellers. So once the buyer pays that price, they're done. They take whatever the good is. They take the pizza, they go home, they eat it. End of the story. It's not the end of the story from the seller's perspective, because the seller doesn't get to keep all of those dollars right there. The seller has to take T dollars away and send them to the government. So if we take that price, subtract T, remember the distance between these two curves is T, that takes us back down to the original supply curve down here, and we get the number of dollars that the seller ends up getting to put in their pocket. The difference between the buyer's price and the seller's price, of course, is the amount of the tax T. So let's think about the implications here. The first one is that quantity falls to Q1, or excuse me, to Q2. Quantity falls to Q2. It drives the buyer's price up, and it drives the seller's price down. And we can think about the incidence or the burden of the tax that falls on both the buyers and the sellers, let's start with the buyers. So the buyer's price started at P1 and it ended up right up here, and that vertical distance represents the tax burden that falls on the buyers, just like it did over here. But we've also seen that the tax is going to fall partially on the sellers. And so that distance that it drives the seller's price down, that's going to be the burden of the tax that falls on the sellers. And so remember, the difference between the two prices is always the amount of the tax T. Let's think about now kind of the implications of this tax. So this is a tax on buyers. This is a tax on sellers. Even though this was a tax on sellers, it ended up falling partially on the buyers because it drove their price up. Why? Because a tax on sellers increases their cost of production. And when their cost of production goes up, the buyers are going to end up having to pay more. But it also falls partially on the sellers. Okay? If we think about the implications here, quantity falls and the tax ends up falling on both sides of the market. Now, if we kind of step back for a second and we think about how this tax on buyers is similar to this tax on sellers and how they're different, well, if you look at the two pictures, there are some obvious differences. In this picture, the demand curve is shifted, and in this picture, the supply curve is shifted. We've got our points B in two different places. So those are the differences, but if you think about the similarities, what you start to realize is that the pictures, in terms of what really matters, the pictures are exactly the same, right? We see that the quantity falls, we see that the buyer's price gets driven up, we've seen that the seller's price gets driven down. The tax burden doesn't fall only on one side or the other, it falls partly on the buyers and partly on the sellers. So in terms of what is happening in these pictures, in terms of the prices and the quantities, they are exactly the same. And that leads us to an important conclusion. And this is extremely important. A tax on buyers is exactly equivalent to a tax on sellers. That is very important. Tax on buyers is exactly equivalent to a tax on sellers. Usually in a face-to-face class, I will put that on the board. I'll wait for everybody to get it written down in their notes, and then I'll just sit there and just wait, hoping that it dawns on somebody what that means. And at this point in my career, it has never happened. No student has ever realized the magnitude of what that means. And I remember back when I was a student, I don't think it dawned on me until the professor said, now stop and think about what's happening right there. Think about what that means. So if you're going to impose a tax on a market, it doesn't matter if you impose that tax on the buyers or if you impose that tax on the sellers. Everything's going to work out exactly the same. The prices will end up exactly the same and the quantities will end up exactly the same regardless of which side of the market you place the tax on. Now, here's the real reason why that's important. It's important because if you think about politics and you think about how much of a particular politician's platform is based on which side of the market they think should be taxed and which side of the market they think should get a tax cut, and then you sit back and realize that it doesn't matter which side of the market you raise taxes on. It doesn't matter which side of the market you cut taxes for. All of that is a smokescreen. It doesn't matter. You either tax a market or you don't. You either lower taxes on a market or you don't. It doesn't matter which side of the market you impose the tax on. Government is powerless to determine how much it drives the buyer's price up and how much it drives the seller's price down. The government does not have that power. And yet, I would argue that there are lots of people out there casting votes based upon something they've been told about which side of the market should be taxed or which side of the market shouldn't be taxed. And now I've just told you that is an irresponsible way to determine your vote. So I would encourage you to think about, listen, when people talk about taxes, listen to which side of the market they think should be taxed, and in the back of your mind, every time they start talking about that, say, you know what, it doesn't matter. Here's an example. So I've heard lots of people say stuff like, you know what, cigarette companies, they're selling a product that just the normal use of the product hurts your health. And so we should tax cigarette companies because they shouldn't be entitled to keep the profits that they get from selling a product that hurts people's health. Well, that's exactly the same thing as saying, you know what, we should tax smokers. It doesn't matter if you tax the sellers of cigarettes or you tax the smokers. It doesn't matter at all. A tax on the cigarette companies is exactly equal to a tax on smokers. And yet there are lots of people that think, you know what, we need to stick it to those businesses. Well, it doesn't matter. If you think that that's somehow sticking it to the business, you're wrong. The tax is going to drive the buyer's price up and it's going to drive the seller's price down, and it doesn't matter which side of the market you tax. As a matter of fact, you could take half the tax and put it on buyers and half the tax and put it on sellers. Same outcome. It's going to drive the price up by exactly the same amount and the seller's price down by exactly the same amount. It will change the quantities by the exact same amount. You could put 10% of the tax on one side and 90% on the other side. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how you split the tax up. Now, once you understand that, then we can think about a different way to illustrate the effect of a tax. Once you're comfortable and you realize that it doesn't matter which side of the market you tax, there's a little bit easier way to do it than these. So I'm going to clear this off and then we'll take a look at that. Let's think about the third way to illustrate the impact that a tax has on a market. So let's, same thing, put a demand curve and a supply curve up here. Here's our equilibrium. With no tax, the price would be P1, quantity would be Q1. Now, if you look back, if you were to look at the notes that you've taken, you'll realize that in both those pictures, the tax on buyers and the tax on sellers, you'll realize that what really matters is that we've ended up in each of those pictures by finding the place where the vertical distance between the demand curve and the supply curve was the amount of the tax. Okay. If you think about the first picture where we placed the tax on buyers, we had a demand curve shifted down, and it was shifted down that much, and it went right through that point. And at some point in that problem, we found we identified that the vertical distance between the demand curve and the new shifted demand curve was the amount of tax T. In the other picture where we had a tax on sellers, we had a shifted supply curve, and it would have been going through that point right there. It would have been T dollars directly above the old supply curve, so it would have been running right through there. But what really matters is that we found the place where that vertical distance between the demand curve and the supply curve is the amount T, and it has to be a vertical distance. You can't angle it like that or you'll get the wrong answer. It's got to be a vertical distance. Once you've identified that, once you've found the place where this distance is T, then that tells you that that's the quantity. Let's call that Q2. There's Q1. Right up here is the buyer's price. And right down here is the seller's price. And we've got the same picture, right? Here's the buyer's burden of the tax. Here's the seller's burden of the tax. And the way that would look, let's suppose that this is a $3 tax. Then what that might look like, so let's suppose the tax is equal to $3. So this distance, if the tax was $3, that distance would be 3. And this distance, you would find the place where this distance between the demand curve and the supply curve is $3. And clearly, if you haven't realized this yet, clearly I would need to give you a picture with a a background here where you could see some grid marks, like a piece of graph paper, that's how you would be able to identify how much that vertical distance is. With a freehand drawn picture like this, you'd never know that that distance was 3. Okay, so on a test problem, there will be a background that will allow you to easily identify where the distance is 3. You know, back here the distances would be much bigger. This might be a distance of 12, and as we get closer the distances get smaller, and you just find the place where that distance is 3. What you're going to find is that part of the tax burden is going to fall on buyers and part will fall on sellers. In this picture it looks like it's split equally. So it could be that $1.50 of that $3 tax falls on the buyers. It drives their price up by $1.50. Drives the seller's price down by the other $1.50. So half the tax could fall on the buyers, half could fall on the sellers. It could be, we'll do it here in a second, I'll change the elasticity of the demand curve compared to the supply curve, and we can make more of the tax fall on one side than on the other. So it could be that $2 of the tax falls on buyers and $1 falls on sellers. Or 50 cents of the tax falls on buyers and $2.50 of the tax falls on sellers. But the burden that falls on buyers plus the burden that falls on sellers has to add up to the amount of the tax. Okay? So let's illustrate what happens when we change the elasticities. So let's draw a couple of pictures here. In my left picture, I'm going to have a relatively elastic demand curve and a relatively inelastic supply curve. And I'm going to identify my initial price of P1, here's P, here's Q, and my initial quantity of Q1. Now over in this picture I'm going to have a relatively inelastic demand curve and a relatively elastic supply curve. Here's my equilibrium, P1, Q1. So I've got two different demand-supply pictures. Let's start by thinking about the demand curve. In this picture I've got elastic demand, and in this picture I've got inelastic demand. Here I've got inelastic supply, and in this one I've got elastic supply. Okay. Now let's use this procedure for figuring out the effect of a tax. So let's suppose that we had a background here and it's a $2 tax, and so we find the place where that vertical distance is $2. And remember, it has to be a vertical distance. So it's going to be something like this. It's not the straightest line I've ever made, but right there, let's suppose that distance is $2. Then what we can do is we can see that right down here is Q2. Right here is going to be the price that the buyers pay. We'll call it PB. And right down here is going to be the price that the sellers end up getting to keep. And you can see that the burden of the tax here is going to fall mostly on the sellers. It's going to drive the seller's price down by much more than it drives the buyer's price up. Okay? Let's put the same tax. Let's find the place over here where we've got a $2 tax. So we're going to take that same distance of $2 and move it right over here. And remember, it has to be a vertical distance, so it's going to be something like that. It's going to be something somewhere right in here. So now let's suppose that that distance in this picture is $2. We can see that it's going to cause quantity to fall to Q2. Right up here is going to be the price the buyers have to pay, PB. And right down here is going to be the price that the sellers get to keep. That's going to be PS. And you can see here that the burden of this tax is going to fall mostly on the buyers. A very small chunk of it's going to fall on the sellers. So what you can see here is that when we've got inelastic supply and elastic demand, most of the tax burden falls on the supply side of the market, which is the inelastic side of the market. Over in this picture, we've got inelastic demand and elastic supply, and here a bigger chunk of the burden falls on the buyers, the inelastic side of the market. So what we get is, here's our general conclusion, a tax burden falls more heavily on the inelastic side of the market. That's a general conclusion. All other things equal, for any tax, the tax burden is going to fall more heavily on the inelastic side of the market. Here, sellers are the inelastic side of the market, and it drives the seller's price down by a lot more than it drives the buyer's price up. Over here, the buyers are the inelastic side of the market, and it drives the buyer's price up by a lot more than it drives the seller's price down. Now, this is relative elasticity. What matters here is the steepness of the demand curve compared to the steepness of the supply curve. Okay, so both demand and supply can be elastic. So if you calculate the elasticity of demand and the elasticity of supply, you could, for both of them, get numbers greater than 1, which would mean demand is elastic and supply is inelastic. But whichever one has the smallest number will be the inelastic side of the market. Okay, so this is relative elasticity that matters here. And that's very important. Let's talk now about what happens to consumer and producer surplus with a tax. So I need to clear this off and then we'll finish up with that. All right, let's take a look at the effect on consumer and producer surplus for a tax. So, price, here's our demand curve, supply curve, there's where quantity goes. Let's identify our initial price of P1 and our initial quantity of Q1. Let's suppose that we've imposed a tax here of $T, and we've found the place where this vertical distance between the demand curve and the supply curve is the amount of the tax T. So right here's going to be the quantity with the tax, let's call it Q2. Right up here is going to be the buyer's price, PB, and right down here is going to be the seller's price, PS. Now I want to label those areas on there, and then we'll be able to figure out what happens to consumer and producer surplus. So let's call that A, B, C, D, E, and F. So as usual, let's start by thinking about what the situation is going to be with no tax. So with no tax, if we had the free market being able to operate, then the consumer surplus is going to be the area under the demand curve and above the price. That's A plus B plus C. Producer surplus is going to be the area under the price and above the supply curve. So that's D plus E plus F. And I know I've said this before, but obviously if you were given a market and you had to calculate consumer surplus, you wouldn't divide it up into these areas. You just calculate the triangle area. I'm dividing it because once we impose the tax, those are going to be appropriate divisions. With no tax, deadweight loss is equal to 0. Total surplus is maximized. Now let's impose the tax. With the tax, let's start with consumer surplus. So now there are two prices. There's the price the buyer pays, and there's the price the seller gets to keep. The buyer's price, the price the buyers pay, is always going to be the highest price with a tax. And the price that sellers end up getting to put in their pocket is always going to be the lower one. Okay, so there should be no confusion as to which is the buyer's price and which is the seller's price. The buyer's price is always going to be this one up here. There's no way the sellers could keep more than what the buyers paid. Okay? Not with the tax. So now let's think about the area under the demand curve and above the buyer's price. With the tax, consumer surplus falls to just A. And so the tax causes consumers to lose B plus C. So consumers lose B plus C. So in terms of economic well-being, the tax clearly hurts consumers. Let's think about producers. Producer surplus is the area under the seller's price and above the supply curve. So it's just area F. And if we think about the loss of producer surplus, producers lose D plus E. So any tax also is going to hurt producers. Let's think about the deadweight loss of the tax. So if we think about deadweight loss, well, remember that with no tax, the free market quantity would be Q1. The tax causes a decrease in economic activity, so quantity falls to Q2, and we lose this chunk of total surplus. C plus E is the deadweight loss. Now, B and D, those don't just vanish. B and D end up going to the government, right? So if we wanted to identify the amount of revenue that the government collects from the tax, so here's government revenue. The government revenue is going to be equal to B plus D. So part of that, B, used to be consumer surplus. That ends up in the pockets of the government. Part of it, D, used to be producer surplus. That ends up in the pockets of the government. And then the government decides how they want to spend it. So it could be that maybe they spend it in such a way that some of that gets back to the consumers and producers. It could be that case. There's another way to calculate government revenue. So we could say also, you can easily calculate government revenue by taking the amount of the tax and simply multiplying it by Q2. So if there's a $1 tax and then 25 units get sold, then the government's going to collect $25, T times Q2. Notice that T times Q2 is also equal to the area of that of B plus D, because the vertical distance, the distance between the two prices, is T, and this horizontal distance from right here out to there is Q2. So, and it's a rectangle, so we don't have to divide by 2. So if you take the vertical distance of T and multiply it times the horizontal distance of Q2, you're getting the area of that rectangle. So both of these are completely equivalent ways of calculating the amount of government revenue. Now, let's stop here for a second and think about how to interpret this. What does this mean? You might say, if you were somebody who, I don't know, didn't like taxes or didn't like government and you wanted to look at this and use it in a way that you think you'd like, then you could say, well, okay, see, here's the deadweight loss, and here's the loss to consumers, and here's the loss to producers, so we shouldn't have any taxes. We should allow the free market to operate freely all the time. Well, the fact of the matter is, if we're going to have a government, we have to have taxes. So I would not take this and say, okay, this is the general conclusion is taxes hurt consumers, taxes hurt producers, we should have no taxes. That's not the right way, that's not the lesson to take away from this. We just have to be aware of the fact that for any tax, it's going to create some deadweight loss. And so we want to be careful about what things we tax. We want to always remember that we are powerless. The government is powerless to determine which side of the market bears the biggest share of the burden. They don't have any power over that. The other thing that I would say is that we need to be aware of the fact that any tax is going to decrease the amount of that good or service that's transacted. And this is a conversation that I will have with a lot of face-to-face classes, a conversation where I say, let's pretend we were starting with a clean slate. Let's suppose there are no taxes. We have a government. We need to have a court system. We need to have a law enforcement system. There are lots of things that we need the government to do, and in order to do that, we need some money. So we have to have some taxes. Let's start from a clean slate and think about what we should be taxing. That's a good conversation to think about. If you remember that anything that you tax, there's going to be less of it, then I would argue as an economist, if we're starting with a clean slate, let's start by taxing things we'd like to see less of. Okay? I would rather tax things that I'd rather see less of. If you look at what we do tend to tax in the U.S., the largest tax in the U.S. is the income tax. And the income tax is a tax on labor. When you look at it that way, you start to think, why would we choose that? We like people to be productive. We like people to go out there and do things that are productive for themselves and for the economy as a whole and for other people. And so why did we choose to tax something that we like? If we tax labor, there will be less labor bought and sold. That's a fact. If you think about it that way, you start to realize that some of the things we tax, maybe we probably should think twice about that. You know, I would argue that if you're somebody who would like to see less smoking, I certainly wouldn't have any problem with taxing that. Or if you would like to see people driving less congestion on the highways, I would be in favor of taxing gasoline. People would buy less gas, they would drive less. So I would, as an economist, tend to target those things before I would target things we like. I always jokingly say that if it was up to me, I would tax D's and F's. I'd rather see less D's and F's in my class, so I would impose a tax on those. If you take my class and you get an F, you got to pay me $500. We'd probably see less D's and F's. Of course, you can't do that, but I would much rather tax things I would like to see less of. Let's talk for just a second about a subsidy. In a lot of ways, a subsidy is just the opposite of a tax. So let's think about consumers' willingness to pay. Let's suppose that we think about what would happen if the government paid you $1 every time you bought a pizza. Well, then your willingness to pay for pizzas would increase by $1 rather than decreasing by $1 like it did with a tax. Or if you're a seller and the government decided to subsidize you, then that subsidy decreases your cost of production. So with a subsidy, instead of the demand curve shifting down by the amount of the tax, it would shift up by the amount of the subsidy. Our supply curve, with a tax, shifts up by the amount of the tax, but with a subsidy, it would shift down by the amount of the subsidy. And when that happened, what you would see is that the quantity ends up increasing. So a subsidy, like I said, in a lot of ways is just the opposite of a tax. A tax reduces the quantity transacted in a market. A subsidy increases the quantity transacted in a market. Here's an important point though. You might think, well, if they're kind of opposites of each other, and if a tax creates deadweight loss by decreasing quantity, then wouldn't a subsidy increase total surplus? No, turns out it doesn't. Remember that when we're talking about a market, here's the right quantity, Q star. We don't want too little of the quantity, and we don't want too much of the quantity. We don't want a policy that pushes the quantity out here to Q2, because that is going to create deadweight loss as well. That creates a situation where here's the cost of production at the margin, and here's how much people value it at the margin. We would never want the quantity of Q2. Having too much of something is just as bad as having too little. Now again, you have to think about what's being subsidized and what's the objective of the government, and there's a whole lot of stuff that goes behind it. But I don't want you to think when I say that a subsidy is the opposite of a tax, I don't want you to think that that means that that the deadweight loss all of a sudden somehow becomes a gain. There's deadweight loss with a subsidy also. Let's do one quick example. I think your book probably includes this example. If it doesn't, we can kind of talk our way through it here real quick. In the 90s, the government imposed what they called luxury taxes. And those were taxes on luxuries, things that rich people bought. Now, the idea there was that Congress wanted to essentially, if you ask Congress, they would not describe it as punishing rich people, but the idea behind those luxury taxes is that rich people needed to pay more. And so what they wanted to do was tax the things that rich people buy. And so they imposed these luxury taxes. These were taxes on private jets and taxes on things like yachts and a whole bunch of other things. Let's just pick one of those and think about the impact that a tax on, say, yachts has. So let's suppose that this is the market for yachts. I think that's how you spell yachts. I don't write the word yachts enough to know, but and the more I say the word yachts, the weirder it starts to sound to me, but I'm pretty sure that's pretty close. Now let's think about the demand for yachts and the supply of yachts. And let's think about which is elastic and which is inelastic. Let's start by thinking about the demand curve. So remember that all other things equal, demand tends to be more elastic when there are more substitutes for the good. And if we're thinking about rich people buying yachts, if the price of a yacht went up, there are lots of other things that rich people can spend their money on. So there are lots of substitutes for yachts, and what that results in is that the demand for yachts tends to be fairly elastic. So if we draw the demand curve for yachts, it tends to be pretty elastic. Now if we think about the supply curve for yachts, turns out that the people who make yachts, the yacht making skills are pretty specialized. They tend not to transfer very easily to other production of other goods. So what that means is the supply of yachts tends to be fairly inelastic. Tends to look something like that. That's what this market tends to look like. Now, if we look at the equilibrium price, P1, and the equilibrium quantity, Q1, and we impose a tax on this, what we realize is, let's impose a fairly big tax. Let's find the place where the vertical distance between our demand curve and our supply curve is the amount of the tax, and let's suppose it's something like that. So there's our tax. We can see that the quantity is going to fall. Less yachts will be bought and sold, and it will indeed drive the buyer's price up. So rich people will pay more for yachts. The problem is that because demand for yachts tends to be fairly elastic, they're not going to pay that much more. It's going to drive the price of yachts up, but not by very much, not compared to how much it drives the seller's price down. Because the supply curve for yachts is very inelastic, it's going to drive the seller's price down relatively a lot compared to how much it drives the buyer's price up. So if we look at the burden of the luxury tax on yachts that fell on rich people, it's relatively small. If we look at the burden of the tax that falls on the suppliers, the sellers of yachts, which tend not to be rich people, we see that they end up bearing the biggest share of the burden. And that is exactly what happened in the 90s with the luxury taxes. Congress passed the taxes, the tax burdens fell disproportionately heavily on the seller's side of the market. And so what ended up happening was yacht manufacturers were going out of business and saying, look, you guys are passing this, putting a tax on buyers, but it's falling on us. And of course, politicians were saying some of them know how this works, some of them don't. So there were politicians saying, well, okay, we're not sure exactly what's happening there, but it's rich people doing something behind the scenes. And the end result was that the luxury taxes were repealed. But it's all very easy to understand if you just understand elasticity and understand that it doesn't matter which side of the market you tax. You either tax the market or you don't tax the market. And the government is powerless to determine which side of the market the burden is going to fall most heavily on. And unfortunately, what you hear, you always hear politicians talking about luxury taxes. They may not call them luxury taxes, but these things are still getting discussed, and people still are talking about them without understanding anything about what's going on there. Let's draw one final picture. Actually, two final pictures. Let's just think about a price ceiling compared to a tax. So let me draw a picture here, demand-supply picture, and a picture there. Let me label things and then I'll get out of the way here so that you can see it. So we've got a demand-supply picture up top and a demand-supply picture at the bottom. And let's think about a price, let's do a price floor up there in our top picture. And let's do a tax down here in our bottom picture. Let's think about a price floor that's imposed right here. What we know with a price floor is that our market's going to want to push price down, but it can only push it down as far as the floor, and the result of that is that right there's our quantity, and right out here is the number of units that sellers want to sell, and we get a surplus. So let's identify our quantity. We get a difference between the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied. If we had a price ceiling, our price would be down here, and we'd have a difference between the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded. A price floor or a price ceiling, when they're binding, they create a surplus or shortage. In other words, quantity demanded is not equal to quantity supplied with a binding floor or ceiling. We get a picture that looks something like that. With a tax, we get something different. We get a situation where we're at a lower quantity, and we get a buyer's price up here, and we get a seller's price down here. So we get a picture that in some ways kind of resembles the price floor, price ceiling picture. But let's think about what's going on down here. When you think about a tax creates a situation where there are two prices. Essentially what a tax does is it drives a wedge between the buyer's price and the seller's price. And the size of that wedge is the amount of the tax T. That distance is T right there. But notice that a tax does not create a surplus or shortage. If we look at where quantity demanded is and where quantity supplied is on that picture, we'll see that they are equal to each other. Now here's the interesting thing. They show up at different places on the picture. If we wanted to find quantity demanded, we would go over from the buyer's price to the demand curve, and we would hit it right there. There's quantity demanded. If we wanted to find quantity supplied, we'd go over from the seller's price to the supply curve, and we hit it right there. There's quantity supplied. They show up at different places in the picture, but notice they're both equal to that quantity. A tax does not create a surplus or shortage. A tax simply drives a wedge between the buyer's price and the seller's price. Quantity demanded is still equal to quantity supplied. So the pictures look similar to each other, but there are some important differences. Keep in mind that both of these policies create deadweight loss equal to this triangle right there. So they look similar, but they're different. So hopefully that gives you an idea of kind of some different types of government policies, how they may or may not achieve the objectives that people who argue for them push. And I'll see you in another video.